I don't know where my students got this thing from, but this is just one of the coolest little props I have in my office. I never even opened it until today. Of course, it's empty, but I mean, isn't that cool? That's such a little trophy. Anyhow, so I don't know about you guys, but I really, really needed that break. That was absolutely necessary. I got to celebrate the birth of my country by blowing up a very small piece of it. And, well, actually a little bigger than usual. God, there were so many fireworks. Anyway, I should have from you your essay 3, which was the eco-narrative, I believe. So now we have about a month left to do both essay 4 and the research project. So we can afford to kind of slow down a little bit and talk about some of the finer qualities of writing. And what I mainly want to talk to you about today, and I'm not really going to jump into the specifics for the last assignment yet. Rather, I want to introduce some ideas for you. I used to start my English 1101 classes with a discussion of the modes. And believe it or not, this is actually kind of controversial because depending on how you teach the modes can be very stifling. The modes of writing are just the avenue with which you decide to approach a writing project. And this can go for both like formal writing, and it can go for creative writing projects as well. Now, my basic idea so far for the final assignment, we just experimented with some creative type writing with our eco-narrative. We have done some research writing with the annotated bibliography, and we also did some of what we would call exposition, which I'll define for you in a minute, which was the political question. Now, I want to get us to something more argumentative. I want you guys to prove some type of opinion, but I want you to do it utilizing some type of story. Now, I'm still in the brainstorming process for this assignment, so why don't I define some fun terms for you? I might go over some old ground a bit, but I get to do that because I'm the teacher. I can do whatever I want. The modes of writing are useful for several reasons. Most of the time when I talk with students who are having difficulty getting started writing, what you would call writer's block, actually has a tendency to be a bit of a modal problem. When you start writing, you have a bunch of different paths in front of you that you can choose to go on. You can choose to go one direction or the other. If you don't have a strong understanding of these paths, you can end up getting a little bit locked. There was a time when I didn't even really think that writer's block was that much of a thing. You're either writing or you're not writing. You can push yourself to write something, and from there, more writing can come, right? I'm the type of person who will sit down and write about Totino's pizza if I get blocked, just because I find that the act of writing itself is the thing that leads to more writing, but that's just me. But I've thought a lot about this question over the years, and I think one of the ways that we can tackle that kind of lock that students get when they're staring at that blank page is to actually stop and think about, well, what are the options available to you when you start out, rather than just, I've got to write this thing, right? Well, let's walk through this one mode at a time. Now, this will make a lot more sense as I actually start describing them to you. The first mode is one that we just finished playing with, and that is narration. Now, narrative is very, I'm getting a headache from having my glasses off. Narration is very simply telling some type of story. A story, and how do we define a story, right? Does it have to be a sequence of events? That sounds pretty dadgum close. A story obviously is some type of sequence of events that is giving us a chain of depictions from some type of perspective or viewpoint, some type. Now, I'm kind of all over the place here, but it's because a lot of these terms are actually difficult to define. Like take this, for instance. We all kind of know what a story is, right? But there are a few wrenches you can throw into this narrative. Does a story have to be told in order? If you've ever seen a movie directed by Quentin Tarantino, you will know that no, that is not the case. You can jump around in a narrative. A lot of stories begin at the ending. and then work their way up in some sort of clever fashion into like that ending, right? Or they can go all over the place. If you've ever seen the movie Pulp Fiction, that narrative is all over the place, right? We never really get a clear sense of what the timeline is. So that characters who have died end up running into each other because we're not exactly sure where we are in the process of the story. That type of story is extremely difficult to do, right? You have to be like a really dadgum good storyteller to tell a story out of order and still make it interesting. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of make it confusing. Stories typically have characters. They have plot and progression. There are ways that you can muck around with these rules and kind of do something kind of twisted with it. But for the most part, unless you're a master writer, it's a good idea to keep the narrative pretty on sorry, I keep getting alerts, on the straight and narrow. You just kind of want to keep moving forward with it. And once you get more confident, then you can start mucking around if you want. So narrative is our starting point. A lot of beginning writers start with the narrative because that's a very easy mode to wrap your head around. It's a story. We all know kind of what a story is. Now, let's talk about description. Description also kind of played into your eco-narrative. Now, description is kind of interesting, and I think I may have tread this ground before, but I think it bears repeating. What is a narrative without description? You're going to have a really bad story if you don't have good sensory details to kind of animate it. And remember, description is best defined as a writing that is primarily appealing to your senses. So you can simply write something that is a description. Why would you want to do that, right? What would the purpose of that be? Likewise, if you're telling a story without much description, you're kind of dead in the water. It's not going to be interesting. It's going to be flat. Part of the reason why teaching the modes is a bit controversial in a pure sense is because the modes run into each other. When we write a text, when we're writing something, we want to mix and match these things up. I can't even begin to wrap my head around what a narrative would look like without some form of description laced throughout it. That's a head exploder, right? I really wish someone would animate the universe exploding thing on my head when I do that. But it would not be good. So these are the two modes that we've worked with primarily so far, is narrative and description. So let's throw out at least two more today. And I'm going to hold off on the last one for a whole video on its own, because that's going to really motivate the writing for the final project. But let's do definition. Definition is extremely important and a lot more dynamic than a lot of students give it credit for. Well, let's engage with a bit of insanity. How do you define definition? That's one of those things that's another moment. Definition is to ascertain the meaning of a word. You don't want to say it's defining a word. You don't want to use a word in its own definition. That's tautological. So it kind of ends up being nonsense. But believe it or not, when we talk about the definitions of words, we get into some pretty hairy areas. I had an argument with a student a long time ago. Don't worry, this student and I got along really, really well. It was, for him, definitions are not something that you should debate. They are set in stone. A word means what you think it means, what the dictionary has basically, identified as its meaning. Like one of my really interesting current example of this problem would be the word irregardless. For someone who's a wordsmith like me, the word irregardless is a bit like vomiting, because it has what we would call like a double negative to it. Regardless means you're not giving it any regard. If you put ear in front of it, you're actually double negating it, which would turn it into kind of a weird pot. It's just, to make a long story short, it's an ugly word, right? Irregardless is a bit self-contradictory. And so there's a lot of English professors out there who will instantly mark irregardless wrong and say that word either does not exist or it does not mean what you think it means. Well, Merriam-Webster's dictionary has put irregardless in as a quantification of a very negative term, which has made a lot of English instructors' heads, right? The debate rages on. Language kind of follows usage. So when we actually talk about definitions, we're dealing with some very wibbly wobbly stuff. Like there's an argument to be made that when people use irregardless, I shouldn't count off for that anymore because now it's in the dictionary. I'm not sure if I'm going to go that far yet, but take this. I'm getting off the beaten path now. This is what happens when you get me talking about definitions. Well, believe it or not, word definitions are one of those things that's just so absolutely interesting to me that I do get carried away with it because, well, I mean, I'm an English person. Back in the Middle Ages, when you had guys like Geoffrey Chaucer writing, you could have stuff like he was not, never, no, going to go. In modern English usage, there's this weird idea that your negatives contradict each other. So if I say I'm never not going to the party, it would mean I'm going to the party, right? But in actuality, that is an algebraic understanding of language, meaning you multiply two numbers to get, you multiply two negative numbers, you get a positive, right? I know. Welcome to hell, everyone. We're talking about math in an English course. But believe it or not, that is a relatively new way of looking at how English operates. In the Middle Ages, and even like in Shakespearean times, they wouldn't have thought that way. Putting the increasing negatives in front of the word would have actually made it increasingly more negative rather than kind of counteracting each other. So to say I'm never not, never going would be like I'm really never going. So I was listening to NPR this morning, and there were all these people like, I will never let my students use the word irregardless. And I'm like, there is precedent for that type of construct. Now, to get back to the idea of definition, could we really hammer out a whole paper arguing definition? Oh my God, yes, we could. You'd be surprised, even beyond the little bits. I'm sorry, I'm messing with my glasses a lot because they broke and I got them taped, and I just remembered I need to make an eye appointment to get a new pair, so they don't sit on my face right. But we argue over word definitions all the time, and we might not be aware of it, but we do. Like, let me give you some examples. Marriage. The definition of marriage has been a societal headache for so long. And not just the obvious one either, where we've got, the Supreme Court giving us legal rulings on marriage that a lot of people don't agree with. But what is a good marriage? Is a good marriage constrained by tradition, or is it more informed of like modern psychiatry? Is it a couple that communicates more openly, or is it a couple that follows more traditional norms? Depending on where you go, that definition changes quite a bit. Here's another one. I have a tendency to lean left on a lot of these things. So if I come off as a really big, nasty liberal, pardon me, tell me about how much you hate it, and I'll give you some bonus points. But an assault rifle. Defining an assault rifle, as a lefty, you'd be surprised my stance on a lot of the gun control issues. I like hunting, right? And I like my shotgun. So I kind of go in some different directions there. Anyway, how do you define an assault rifle? What is it that makes an assault rifle? And you like how I'm doing that there. How do we actually, determine that? And why would we want to? Well, the reason this starts to get hairy is because the way that you define a quote unquote assault rifle is one of the starting points for the gun control debate narrative. Not narrative, he said the thing. One of the start off points for the conversation of how we do gun policy in this country. And so for a lot of people, there is no such thing as an assault rifle. A gun is an assault weapon, right? It's meant to hurt. But in other circles, an assault rifle is I'm trying to think, and I might get this wrong. If I get this wrong, don't come after me, because I'm kind of pulling this out of thin air. But I think it doesn't even have to be fully automatic. It can be semi-automatic with a large capacity magazine. It needs to be able to spray bullets in a wide area really, really fast. I think that would be like technically the military's definition of an assault rifle, because they have a definition that might differ from, another organization's definition of it. I'm trying to think of some other ones. Anyways, I imagine you guys kind of get the picture here. Finding a controversial word and looking at the definition of that word and trying to engage with that definition is a surefire way to spill a lot of ink on the page. You can wrestle with these definitions quite a bit. This kind of harkens back to an old English teaching strategy I used to run into in high school, where you'd be writing a paper and you'd be like, Miss Schumann, that's not a real name. I'm just, again, pulling it out of thin air. Miss Schumann, how do I make my paper interesting? How do I start? And she's like, well, one of the things that you could do, I like how Miss Schumann's like an enlightened, erudite professor from the 40s. Well, David, you could potentially offer up a definition and just to pull it from the dictionary and start with that. Oh, man, how exciting. Michael Bay, take some direction for your next movie. But in any case, that's actually, if you're going to use a word definition, you don't want to just vomit it out there and take it at face value. You kind of want to challenge it a little bit, right? You want to do something with the definition rather than just kind of laying it out there flat and just sort of flop like a fish, right? You want to engage with it. And I always find the thing I want to tell my students is, don't be intimidated and don't think about engaging with word definitions in a way that you can actually question, is this true? What are some different ways that we could define this? What are the problems that might bring in? What are some problems with the current definition of a societal term? Or, anything. There's a lot of different directions you can go in with this. So that's definition, coming up and ascertaining the meaning of terms or words. You'll find that developing a lot as you start engaging in argumentation, which is our fifth mode, but I'll get to that one in a minute. Let's stop instead and talk about exposition. Now, exposition is really, really interesting for a lot of different reasons. Exposition, a lot of people don't even know how to even begin defining that, because it's not something you really see very much in life. Exposition is when you are trying to talk about a process, to show off, to demonstrate. When I teach my technical writing course, we are dealing primarily with exposition. Exposition can be things like how-to articles, workplace memos giving directives, manuals. Those are all expository in nature because they try to discuss or narrate through some type of process. That's expository writing. Now, interestingly, exposition also includes the classical essay format. Anytime you were told to sit down in high school and write an essay about your opinion on something, you were kind of attempting something expository, because a classical essay is not necessarily just supposed to be argumentative. Rather, it's supposed to explore a concept and kind of like expand your knowledge of the subject by writing the essay, right? So essays fall right into the exposition camp. And we don't ever really explain this to students. It doesn't fall into narration. It doesn't fall into pure description. It's not pure description. And they can really wrestle with definition a lot of times. But those classical essays are very expository in nature. We do a lot of exposition writing in the modern world. If you're writing like if you're just kind of narrating out your day and just describing your day, and like just engaging with people on social media, looking for jobs, all the stuff that you do that has some type of form or function to it, other than just like expression, is very close to exposition. Writing a form, writing a function. So that is that's a form of writing that I found really helps students if they're struggling with the more creative stuff. Like, let me use this as an example. A lot of my students come in and they struggle with the idea of doing like a research paper in the traditional sense of like, getting the opinion and arguing the opinion, which, like I said, we'll come to argumentation in a minute. I'll give you a brief introduction to that. I want to hold off on it for this time because I want to give that its own video. But exposition is a really cool way to introduce research in a kind of more friendly packaging with my welders. And my father was a welder, so I really have like a great deal of like kind of weird kinship with my welding students. I have found that for them, doing research in regards to some type of exposition writing is really useful. And it kind of is very, very natural for a lot of students. And one of the ways that really shapes up is a how-to article. Doing a nice personal perspective how-to writing that uses research to kind of buff up its points is a really cool way for a lot of students to use research in a way that's a little bit more natural for them. So how-to writings have a little bit of kind of like an odd and argumentative context to it because it's like, this way is the best way. You really should kind of, go about this process the way you want to go through this, the way you want to try to achieve this particular thing that I'm trying to show you how to do. But in any case, how-to articles are extremely useful if you're having trouble incorporating research and getting some good basic structure down. I really like a good how-to article myself. They're fun to write too. But in any case, our final mode, and this is the one that I really want to focus on for our final assignment, is argumentation. Argumentation can take from everything that came before. And all argumentation is, I ask students to define argument. Like, let's engage a little definition. And a lot of students like, that's when you're fighting about something. No, that's a fight. That's an argument. Argumentation and argument basically means that you're taking a stance on something and you're defending that stance or suggesting that stance, right? You don't even necessarily have to have anybody fighting back with you to have an argument. It's a point. It's an opinion. So opinionated writing is going to be the basis of argumentation. And that actually is much more complicated than many people think. There is a lot of stuff packed into argumentation. Now, the point with this particular lecture, for me, when I'm teaching the modes, I have found that this can be a good way to get you guys started if you're stuck, rather than just saying, I got to write a paper. If you're like, I'm going to start with a narrative, or I'm going to define a word, or I'm going to describe a baseball, or I'm going to argue why you're an idiot. These things have a tendency to help students get their feet on the ground and get walking or running. So I like to kind of put this in as we go towards the big final project, because the final project is, in essence, going to ask you to include all of these things in some capacity. So on Thursday, I'm going to post a video that's going to dive into argumentation, the last mode. We're going to really tear that thing apart. For a discussion question this week, what I'd like for you to do, I want you to tell me what you think is your favorite mode of writing and why. That is so lame, but that's what we're doing. If you want to wait till my argumentation lecture, that's fine, just as long as you do it at some point this week. So that'll kind of give you a little crunch at the end, but anyhow, you guys, I'm happy to be back. I'm happy to be a little bit rested after having blown up a small part of my country. Thank you very much, and I can't wait to get this last big assignment together.